My name is Gilberto Jinojosa. I'm pleased to be the moderator for this session and to introduce Amy Porter. Dr. Porter completed her PhD at Southern Methodist University and taught at some very interesting courses, by the way, at Georgia Southwestern State University, and came to Texas A&M in 04, something, I believe, right? 09, okay. And where she is Associate Professor of History. Her book, published in 2015, Their Lives, Their Wills, Women in the Borderlands, 1750 to 1846, was published by Texas Tech University Press. I had read it when it came out, and then I reread it prior to this session and enjoyed it once again. And it has won some prizes very correctly, rightfully. And she is she teaches early America and Spanish borderlands and women's history at UTSA's competitor on the south side, Texas A&M at San Antonio. Amy, thank you.
All right. Thank you, Gilberto. For a second, I thought you were going to say that I taught at UTSA. I'm so used to having to correct that. But you knew exactly what you were saying, so I appreciate that. I'd like to thank the Whitty for putting together this conference. This is really exciting. The Tricentennial is an exciting time of year for all of us who love history. And it's wonderful to see so many speakers, so many panels on early San Antonio history. As a colonial Americanist, I often complain that some of my colleagues get to teach classes that cover a decade or 2 decades, and I'm teaching colonial America that covers hundreds of years, and of course, if we look at the prehistory, thousands of years in a semester, and it just doesn't seem fair because this is such rich, rich history. So thank you all for your interest, and I look forward to hearing your questions and getting your feedback on some of the thoughts that I'll present to you all today. So my interest in history, of course, is in the Spanish borderlands in the early period. It's also in women, gender, and families, and that's what I will focus on today. Okay, good. I hadn't tried that yet, so I'm glad that works. So I want to start with these questions. First of all, where are the stories of the women and children of early San Antonio? So in my mind, these stories are really important to tell. When we do history, when we write history, when we do this research, there's so many different questions we ask and so many different types of stories that we need to uncover. And the individuals are really important in telling these stories. But doing this for the women, the children, the families can be very challenging. So how can we tell these stories when few written documents exist? So where are these stories? Let me start there. I think when we tend to think of the history of early San Antonio, we might, if we think about it in a little bit more detail, tend to think of it as a rather masculine history. We think about the missionaries who came, of course, who are men. We think about the soldiers. We might think about the government officials. And why do we think about these people first? Right. They're in the documents. They're the ones writing the documents, too. All of these documents that you'll see that I use in my research were written by men. So they're telling those stories. That doesn't mean the women aren't in those documents. So you'll see how I make use of census documents. Wills have been extremely important in my research. So women left behind wills, although they're not physically writing them down. They are creating their will with somebody else writing it down. Court cases as well. Yet that's a challenge. Historians, especially historians who do social history, who do women's history, love to use letters and diaries. I mean, those are the great sources where you can really get into somebody's mind and see what's going on in their daily lives. But we don't have those for this period of time. especially for the women in particular. In general, we're talking about a time and place where literacy rates are rather low compared to, our standards today. There's other obstacles. There's times paper is scarce. So, are you going to be writing, what you're doing every day, your innermost thoughts? No, you're recording business transactions, policies, the most important things for the workings of the community. The places, I think, besides looking into these written documents and looking beneath the surface for these stories that can be helpful, come from material culture and archaeology. Objects can tell us quite a bit. And then, of course, there's the work of family historians. And some of you all, I know I recognize some of you all here, do this work. And you all know many of these stories as well, and that's helped me tremendously. So let's get into it. Okay, I want to start here. Even though my research focuses more on Spanish society and families within Spanish society, I do want to spend a little bit of time acknowledging the people who were here before and the changes that were brought when the Spanish arrived. So thinking about the indigenous people who lived in the San Antonio area or who moved through the San Antonio area, as we talk about nomadic, semi-nomadic peoples. Family, of course, was really important there. This is one of those ways I think we can get beyond this more masculine history. I think almost immediately when you think about the indigenous peoples, you think about families in maybe deeper ways. Historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, others who look at this prehistory and look at these indigenous peoples can tell us quite a bit about the way we think about gender roles. So for one, we know that gender roles, these are social constructs. They change over time, over place, from society to society. And looking at Native families helps us see that. So there's great diversity amongst these groups, so just allow me to sort of generalize here. When we look at indigenous people, we see gender roles that are clear. There are tasks for women, there are tasks for men. Women tend to be in charge of agriculture, of gathering. Men tend to be in charge of hunting, warfare. Oftentimes women are responsible for the house or the home, sometimes building them, repairing them in many cases. So there are these clear gender roles, but what's important to us is that Native people viewed these roles as complementary. When we get to the Spanish, we're going to be talking about power in a patriarchal society and some challenges to that. But when we look at the Native peoples, we're thinking about gender roles in very different ways. These societies understood men's and women's roles as equally important. You can't survive without one. There's this balance here that's extremely important. And yes, you have societies where if hunting and warfare are maybe more important, it's less of an agricultural society. Maybe there's a little bit clearer political power for men, or even religious power. But even in those societies, you see women who play very important roles in religion, in spirituality. Women or female figures as keepers of the game in those stories. So I think there are important lessons to be learned there. Now, it's also important to note that once Europeans arrive, there's going to be obviously huge disruptions, major changes that will impact these indigenous people. One of the most important will be, of course, the demographic disaster caused by disease. And I just want to point out here, when we talk about disease, I think we can also think about this demographic disaster in gendered ways, because while disease strikes almost everybody, it's so devastating. One of the things we see is that women, if they survive maybe smallpox or some of these other diseases to which they've had no exposure before, if they survive, if they were pregnant, they're more likely to miscarry. And then they're also more likely to not be able to have children, to be sterile. So they are facing this double disaster where so many people are dying, but then they're unable to reproduce the population, right? So that's one major change. The other thing we see, and there's going to be a panel after this one that talks more about indigenous people and interactions with the Europeans. If we look very specifically at the missions, or if we just look at the ways that Europeans interpreted indigenous families, there is going to be a lot of misunderstanding. We have more than two, but different worldviews and misunderstandings. So the Europeans, when they see indigenous women doing agriculture, doing some of the work that they do, they think that they are treated horribly and they are doing men's work. And there will be these efforts to change the gender roles, to have them conform with these European views of gender. And there can be complications too when we're talking about other Indian groups who visit San Antonio for trade or peace purposes. Juliana Barr talks about this in her work, but the importance of having women in those groups to indicate this is a peaceful party, right? We are here for trade, or we are here to talk, to gift giving, if I can talk about it in more indigenous terms, rather than, hostile intentions. And the Spanish don't understand this. And when the Spanish approach at times with an all-male force, how do the indigenous people interpret this, right? Do they see this as threatening, certainly confusing? So there are all these misunderstandings and negotiations, and many of those have to do with gender and misunderstanding of gendered roles. And I will talk a little bit more about indigenous people making their way into Spanish families in Spanish society as I go through this. So let me move forward. Okay, so Spanish families from the beginning. We date this Tricentennial year as 1718, so I'll begin here. As the Spanish move into this area that would become San Antonio, as they found Mission Valero and the Presidio, and as I mentioned before, we think of this as these, masculine endeavors and all of these men coming. There are families coming from the beginning. There are families coming with the Presidial soldiers. There are, not all of them, there are also single soldiers. There are artisans, skilled tradesmen who come to the area, and some of them bring families. Frank de la Teja, who of course is speaking next door, in his work he talks about by 1730 how there are already 40 married couples in the San Antonio area. This is very early, right? So we already have to move beyond that idea of just men coming to the area. Although I should say, there are more men than women, and there is a very uneven gender ratio. And that will certainly characterize San Antonio for a while, and it will have major implications for the settlement. Generally, when we look at a settlement and there is this uneven gender ratio where there's more men than women, we see this as an unsettled place, right? We're not to the point of permanency, stability yet. Okay. And then in the 1730s, Spain is trying to find people to move to this far northern frontier. Spain is interested in many things. You have the missionary movement, so religion is very much a part of this. But they also want to be able to settle and hold this frontier. It will offer protection for areas of their empire maybe they consider more valuable. But you're not going to do this unless you have settlement, unless you have families. And they're having a hard time getting people to come here, believe it or not. This is a hard sell in the early 1700s. Please move north, we'll give you land. There's great advantages to being there. There's very few people who live there. Yes, there's a presidio. Yes, maybe there's some Indian raids, some uncertain relations with Indians. Spain couldn't get people, not enough people to come here, so they turned to the Canary Islands. And they try to recruit, they want somewhere between 200 and 400 families. In the end, they end up with 15, they say 16, right? So 15, and then there's the one family of single men who they put together and say is a family, which I find absolutely wonderful and fascinating when I look at, this early family history of San Antonio. But it provides a lot of lessons for us because we see this effort to bring families to the frontier. It reminds us again how big, how broad the Spanish world is. right? Many of the people who've come before, they're coming from more central parts of the empire, from Mexico. Maybe they've moved to Coahuila, Nuevo León, and they move further north to the San Antonio area. But here we have people coming from very far away, making very difficult journeys. 2 women amongst this group are widows or are widowed along the way. So we have Maria Rodriguez Robaina. She also is known as Betancourt. She will remarry later. She has 6 children, I believe, when she arrives, a 1-month-old. So she has a child along the way. Another woman, Mariana Delgado Maliano, has 3 children. I think they're 3 to 16 years old. I mean, this is a tremendous journey, a tremendous story in and of itself. But, imagine the experiences of children, or a mother, fathers too, traveling with children. I remember not wanting to go to the grocery store with my 3-year-old, right? I mean, this is a tough journey. But from the beginning, we have these female-headed households, and widows are going to continue to play a really important role in this early history of San Antonio. And by the way, they'll get land. They're going to be recognized as head of households, and then they'll face pressure to remarry. That's sort of another story there. Okay. Let me take just a second to talk about these ideal gender roles. When we're talking about gender, it's important to note that there are certain ideals that society expects girls and boys to learn and to grow into as they become adults. These are ideals. This is not the reality on the ground necessarily, but it has major impacts, because if you can't live up to these ideals, or you violate these ideals in major ways, you can face all types of exclusion from society, right? Or gossip or other forms of social control that will try to get you in line. So I mentioned this earlier. We consider the society a patriarchal society in that formally men have the political power. They have the formal power. So we see them as the head of the household. We see men with the formal government roles, the formal church roles. Now, there are many ways, I think, that we can question this patriarchal system to some extent. We're going to see so many female-headed households. We're going to see what role widows play in all of this. And then I think, as we always have to do with women's history, we have to understand the informal power that women have as well. But that being said, the men are the head of households. As father, they are to protect their family. They are to be strong. They are to be religious. They are to protect the honor of their family. And honor can involve many different things here. Now, for men in this society at this time, they can also, their sexuality is much less prescribed than women's, I can say it that way. It's okay if they have relationships to a certain extent with other women. There are ways that is controlled, but for women, that is not okay by any extent. For the women, the ideal woman, she is under the authority of her husband, in this sort of hierarchy, this patriarchal system. She is to be pure, demure, spiritual. You'll see later I refer to women as sort of the spiritual heads of household. They are to stay at home, or if they go out of the home, they would be with their husbands, or they would be with other people. They're not going out by themselves. In many ways, they're responsible. We're not talking about a separate spheres idea that would develop in the 19th century. But at the same time, we're talking about this idea that women do have more power sort of within this private realm of the home, this rather informal realm. Children, they will learn these gender roles quite early. And they are to respect their parents, to listen to their authority, and often to gain their approval for marriage. Okay, so that gives you sort of an idea, a snapshot there. All right. So What do these people experience? What is life like for families on this frontier? It is a really rough existence. Life expectancy is low throughout much of this period of time, the Spanish colonial period in the San Antonio area. It's often around 32 years of age or so, which if you look at census documents or you look at wills or other records, you will see people who live into very advanced age. But infant mortality rates are very high, so that definitely lowers the life expectancy. That means with that life expectancy, you're going to see many widows. Men are widowed as well. What sort of happens is we tend to see a different age of marriage between men and women. So men tend to marry younger women. And women, if they survive childbirth, tend to outlive their husbands. And that explains this more likely occurrence of widowhood for women than for men. You also have a large number of orphans. So why is life expectancy so low? There are outbreaks of epidemic disease that continue to be problems into the late 1700s. There are Indian attacks at times. I mean, this is a frontier community with this military presence. There are not doctors. There's not much medical care. There are people with medical knowledge who provide this care on the frontier, but it's very, very limited. So accidents, all types of things can lead to early death, and we see that here. And I just pulled an example. A lot of the research I've done is with wills. So I pulled one of these that I see as rather typical. This is a San Antonio will from 1785. This woman, Juana de Hoyos, she was from Coahuila originally, which again tells this story of this movement north. But she's in San Fernando, the Villa of San Fernando, the San Antonio area, when she writes her will. She notes that she was married to Andres Hernandez, now deceased, very common. And during the marriage, we had 5 boys, of which 1 died without an heir, and 2 daughters. So again, this common story. Many of these women lost children. Some of them are absolutely tragic, women who have lost all of their children. They've outlived all of their children. So, I think when we talk about the individual experience in these stories, we have to understand the difficulty of losing loved ones in this way, in this place. I have another documentary example trying to show you all different ways that we can find these stories within these documents. This is just a snapshot of the 1790 census, and I know I've jumped forward in time here, but the census records tend to be from the later colonial period. But I tried to put in bold, I hope you all can see that in the back. Widow. I mean, there's just a few people listed on this census, and we have the first woman, widow, age 27. And of course, she has young children. We have another one, age 44. And nobody else listed in that household. And then 28, and she has children, young children as well. So you can take almost any page of these census documents and you're going to see how common this is. But let me make this point. This doesn't even tell you just how common this is, because some of these women who are listed as married are remarried at this point. So when you glance at the census, it's not showing them as a widow. If you can find their wills, and not everybody left a will, it will tell you if they had been married before. And how many times? Sometimes women were widowed twice and remarried, were in a 3rd marriage. So it's not the complete picture, but I think it gives you the idea of this experience and this circumstance. Okay. Another one here, if I can talk briefly about Spanish households. So I've talked about family. When we're talking about Spanish families, generally we're talking about an idea that involves blood relatives And then by law, if we're talking about inheritance, we're also talking about passing on property through these bloodlines. If we're talking about the household, we're talking about something broader. There can be other people included in the household that would be under, the father's authority, or possibly, if we have a widow, her authority. So here, this is another pull from the census. You see an orphan listed and a servant noted there as an Apache. So who do we see in these households? I noted at the bottom, we see orphans. I mentioned before with those devastating mortality rates, there are children who are orphaned. And what does the community do with them? There aren't orphanages. There's not a system in place to help these children, to incorporate them into society and to care for them. So families do this. Sometimes they're relatives of families who take them in. Sometimes they're neighbors. Sometimes they're godchildren. And many times we have no idea who they are, but they're noted as orphans. And then sometimes, people try to figure out, who is that orphan? Could this possibly be an illegitimate child who somebody is trying to hide the fact that they're illegitimate? It's possible, we don't know, but I can tell you that illegitimate children are noted all the time in census documents and often in wills. So I'm not sure there's a huge need to hide them, but we don't know. I think what we see with bringing orphans into families also shows the flexibility and adaptability of people on the frontier to sort of reform and rethink families and to help one another out. We also see servants listed in these documents, servant as an occupation. This is where things can get a little bit tricky. Sometimes we see criados as well. Are you all familiar with that term, criado? So sometimes I believe there's not a difference. I think sometimes criados are being called servants. I think sometimes there are people, especially women in Spanish society, who, due to their economic situation, have to work as servants, essentially. So the criados would be indigenous people who were oftentimes captured by Plains Indian groups. Comanches were very active in this captive trade, so they would raid other Indian groups. They would take especially women and children captive, and they would bring them to Spanish society, and Spanish people would pay this rescate, this ransom, to free the person, the indigenous person, bring them into their households. And the criado would be raised in that household. They would be baptized, taught Christianity, taught Spanish ways. Now, the role they played in these families is a little bit harder to figure out. I think there's quite a spectrum here. These criados were often servants, sometimes treated almost like slaves. Sometimes they were incorporated into the families and made heirs in some rare circumstances, I would say. I feel like we know a lot more about New Mexico and criados than we do about Texas and San Antonio in particular, just due to some of the research that's been done. But if you go to the baptismal records, if you go downtown to Texana Room and you look through those books of the baptismal records, there are especially certain periods of time throughout the 18th century, you will see a large number of young Apaches in particular, sometimes it'll say Comanches or other Indians who are being baptized in society. Now, trying to track where they go, they often just have a first name. You can look at who their godparents are. It can be rather difficult to track, and that's why we don't know exactly where these people go. Sometimes they're, depending on the period of time, staying in missions. Sometimes they're going into households. So I'll leave it there. Maybe we can explore that more a little bit later. There are also some slaves in the San Antonio area. I'm not going to say too much about this. My colleague, Francis Galan back there, can tell you more if you want to know more about slavery in early Texas. But there are some slaves of African descent in the area. They're not very many. This certainly is not a slave society. And in fact, the few that I've seen in wills, many of the slaves end up being freed at some point, maybe upon the person's death or at the age of marriage. So these slaves seem to be treated more like some of the servants are from what I've seen in the documents. So we have this broader idea of households here. Oh, the other thing I would like to point out about the criados in particular and this idea of bringing indigenous people into Spanish households, if you think about the women in particular and think about the roles they're going to be playing in those households, especially in the kitchen, especially making food, I think we're going to see this major influence of Indian peoples on Spanish households and their culture, foodways in particular. Okay. I mentioned earlier that women become the spiritual leaders of their families. So if we look at Spanish San Antonio, there's no convents here. There are convents in other Spanish communities in New Spain, and that provides certain opportunities for women to devote their lives to spirituality. That's not an opportunity here. If you look at the church, the formal leadership of the church, there's not women, but that does not mean everything when we're talking about women in spirituality in San Antonio. So where do we see this? One place that's very clear is through this material culture. So women become primarily responsible for maintaining these altars within their homes. You can see the trajectory. You can track these belongings, these items, as they are passed on, oftentimes in this matrilineal way, from woman to daughter, and so on. And some of these are still in families today. I have two images here that are from a private collection of Corky Rubio. And he has an amazing collection. He's been able to find some of these things and at times track these stories, and some of them are very, very old. They're the bultos, the carvings, the little statues, they're paintings, and these things together would form an altar in the home and would be passed on. And this was very important to have this core spiritual presence within the home. We also see women very involved in the religious activities of the community. They can be members of these cofradías. They can help organize religious festivals and feasts. The documents that I've used, many women asked to be buried in a brown robe like St. Francis, and they often mention they were members of the Third Order of St. Francis. So they're extremely involved in the religion. You can't just look at the surface and look at the church and say the priests are men, the missionaries are men. This does not get anywhere near the religious truth, I think the religious history of these people in this place. Okay. Looking at economic roles, women's property rights play a tremendous role in explaining the power, and not just informal power in this case. I think we're going to move a little bit more into the realm of formal power of women in this early community. So under the Spanish system, most of you all know this, you might or might not find it surprising, but women have very strong property rights. They can bring property into a marriage and it remains their property. There's community property rights, so that everything that a family earns during their life, or a family, a husband and wife, belongs to them equally. Inheritance laws mean that daughters and sons are going to inherit fairly equally. No one heir can inherit more than 1/3 to 1/5 of the estate. And in the San Antonio area, this is generally how it plays out. Those laws are followed. There are dowries that are given to the couple, but really the property belongs to the woman in that the husband cannot sell it or misuse that property without the wife's consent. So what we have then, and we saw it from the beginning with the Canary Island families, right, with the two widows, we have women who own property, and some of them own a lot of property. So some major landholders in colonial San Antonio are women. Some of them become very involved in ranching, often through inheritance, but there are examples of some women petitioning for land, increasing their land holdings. But almost any period of time, if you look at the figures, the number of cattle that people own, you're going to see at least one woman, maybe several in the upper ranks. If you look at the brands, there are women who have, in some cases, several brands, probably inheriting them through, in different ways, maybe from husbands, maybe from fathers as well. So they're very involved in ranching. Where else do we see women playing an important economic role in these communities? I found when I looked at the wills that there's also beneath the surface, you can look at the businesses, and women are helping out with those businesses. If their husbands are merchants or government officials, when they travel, the women run the businesses, right? But beyond that, if you look beneath the surface at this informal economy, and while you have a formal economy and you have some money in circulation, you also still have a barter economy throughout much of this period of time. You have women who are lending items, sometimes lending money to family members, to neighbors, to friends, sometimes to other people in the community, and they always note it in their wills. This person owes me this. The executors of my estate need to try to get this back. I don't think anybody ever does, based on what I've seen in those documents. So they're playing this important economic role in this informal way. And why is that so important? Because we're talking about a underdeveloped economy. This San Antonio area, ranching can provide some income. But we're largely talking about sustenance. There's not a lot of money in circulation. There's not a lot of capital. So if you have widows and they have some capital, it's going to be important in helping this community survive. And when we look at the lending items, helping the family survive, the neighbors, this community in a smaller sense, in a smaller way. Okay. Oh, I have this, sorry about this terrible picture. I was trying to find... This is my photography. I was trying to find photos that I had the rights to, so it just looks like a field, but Clint McKenzie can tell you, yeah, that's what it looks like, right? The current site of the Rancho de las Cabras. Okay. Some of the markers out there due to the extensive and wonderful archaeological work. Just a word about material culture. You all, I hope, have seen or will go through the exhibit. When you do this, I encourage you all to think about material culture and items in these gendered ways. There are things that belong to women and things that belong to men, and there are things that belong to both. I pulled just this little excerpt from a will. I declare as my property a house of 12 varas, a very small area of land, with stone walls, a thatched roof, and a kitchen made of wood and straw. You'll see in the exhibit, you'll hear about the jacales, and the important role they played in early San Antonio. But the other thing you need to keep in mind is that these houses, they grow, they change, they're rather organic. Many people start off with the jacales, and as they become more permanent or get more wealth, you see more stone added to it. She also has an old but good chest, a metate, 2 pots, a griddle, a boiler, 2 kettles, a pot with 3 legs. These kitchen items, these are women's items, right? We can think about this within the labor roles of women. And I have an image of a metate in mano there. Let me point out, too, the old but good chest. These words are really important here. I've been looking recently at the work of medieval Europeanists to try to get ideas about how to understand the history, how to use sources and methodologies in innovative ways to look at people who don't leave behind, as many written documents as you might like. And they do really interesting work with material culture. And they talk about reuse and recycling of items. So this becomes key. These are items that are passed on and used over and over again. So it might be old, but it's still good. It still has value, and it will be passed on. And one more just to show some other women's items. And then the chair, this is not, I don't consider this a gendered item, but I just think it's really cool, the ingenuity of people on the frontier. If you can see the joint there, how this chair is put together with a scarcity of metal, with a lack of nails, and there actually are some nails in the top part, but they fit together like perfect puzzles. I've seen this, the Martinez Hacienda just outside Taos, New Mexico. The last time I went there, which was a long time ago, they had furniture you could take apart and put together, and you could see exactly how it worked. And it's just amazing. People adapt to their surroundings. For the last few minutes here, this might seem like an abrupt jump, but I was asked to speak just a little bit about the experiences at the end of the Spanish colonial period, as we see so many disruptions and efforts towards Mexican independence and the impact this has on women and children in particular. There will be another panel this afternoon, particularly on the Battle of Medina, so I can foreshadow that just a little bit, but give you a few ideas here of how to think about that and the impact of that in even gendered ways. So I've already outlined this difficult place to live. It gets worse in the 1810s. As the independence movements starting, from Father Hidalgo spread north, San Antonio has their own small revolt, counter-revolt. But when things really heat up in 1813, you have, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, give too much background information, but you have the Republican Army of the North under Bernardo Gutierrez de Lara and Augustus McGee, Americans and Spanish and some Native Americans who come to Nacogdoches and then Goliad and then San Antonio. And they want to launch Mexican independence through Texas. And what does that mean for the civilians of Texas? It means quite a lot. Just to foreshadow just a little bit here, the general who will lead Spanish royalist troops into the San Antonio area, Joaquin Arredondo, he will be coming from Mexico, moving north, and he's in Nuevo Santander before he's in San Antonio. And if we look at what he does there, the way he conducts business, it gives us a good idea of what's going to happen in this area. He raises taxes dramatically, and he's there also, by the way, trying to put down rebellion. Raises taxes so high that they are a true burden on families. Families are talking about not being able to survive, not having enough food. There are many reports of sexual assaults on women, and he's either allowing it, not stopping it. It's uncertain, but they're happening. So bad, in fact, that men that he's recruited to his army to put down rebellions are deserting to go protect their families. They're so worried about this situation. Now, one of these men from the Nuevo Santander area, Ignacio Elizondo, will lead troops north towards San Antonio. They're going to be camped outside of San Antonio, northwest. I tried to put a map up there that shows you sort of where Alisán Creek is. But at the Battle of Alisán, soldiers from the Republican Army of the North come out and attack Elizondo's group. It's early in the morning. There's families with this army. This is common during this period of time. We tend to think of armies and military, well, some of us do, many of us don't, as being the men and the soldiers. But there's women, there's children with them, and they're at mass in the morning. And cannons and fires turned on these people, and there's women and children casualties. So from the beginning, when we're talking about this fighting, we're very directly talking about impact on women and children, besides the number of men who are killed. As the big battle, the devastating battle of Medina takes place just outside of San Antonio, and again, if you want to hear more about this, I encourage you to go to the other panel. There's one really obvious implication for women and children. A huge number of men are killed. I think Robert Tonhoff estimated, maybe half the adult male population of Spanish Texas was killed, maybe 1/3 the male population of San Antonio. It's hard to say exactly, but it's devastating. This means larger number of widows and some orphans as well. So that's one obvious implication. Widows were rounded up and placed in La Quinta, a house in downtown San Antonio, where they were forced to make tortillas, to labor long, long hours for the soldiers of Arredondo. And they faced sexual assault as well. I think it's a little bit coded if you could look at this quote by Navarro here. At the end, they endured their outrageous captivity with spirited courage before yielding to the shameful proposals of the jailers. So what's happened here, and by the way, these women can't take care of their children. Their children are on the streets begging for food, and they're housed there for 2 months before, a story says, a mob formed and forced Arredondo to release the women. It's going to happen again, though. So there's a group that tries to flee to Louisiana, and Elizondo actually goes after them. He doesn't make it back, he dies. But they do capture some people. Men are executed. Some people make it to Louisiana. The women are brought back and forced to stay at La Quinta again. It happens again. And there are more stories of sexual assaults, of public stripping of women. What's happening here, this is about punishing the rebels, about sending a message, but it's also about dishonoring these families. Public nudity has very clear implications in this society. This is a woman of shameful status. This is a dishonored family. The man could not protect this family, and that was part of the message that was being sent there. Very, very harsh. There were property confiscations. Some women lost property. And remember, there's community property. So even when men are having property confiscated, in the Spanish terms, it's women's property too. And then Arredondo's policies at the end of this time will lead to many hardships for families. So he's going to try to stop all the rebellion. He's going to tell people on outlying farms and ranches, come into San Antonio and turn in your guns. Indian raids in the outlying areas increase. Livestock's killed. Ranches are burned. So there are food shortages in San Antonio, in the San Antonio area for years. There's this major economic impact. And in fact, with Mexican independence in 1821, families are still suffering, but it actually brings some reprieve. Some changes in policies. So this is just an extremely difficult time for families in these areas. So many men were killed, but so many of the women and their children survive. And then, soon after that, many of these families are going to be involved again in the fights for Texas independence. You'll see some of those same family names once again. So I'll finish there so we have time to take some questions, but I did put up some sources that I've used to inform my talk, or if you're interested in some of these different areas, and I have another page. This newest book, Arredondo by Bradley Folsom, just won a bunch of awards at the Texas State Historical Association meeting, but it tells a lot about his mindset and his activities. And then I have another slide that talks about women in early San Antonio, and then Battle of Medina as well. So I will go ahead and stop there and take questions. Oh, thank you.
Are textiles ever mentioned in the wills?
Yes, I didn't talk about clothing. That's another gendered item very clearly. Yes, and sometimes they're described in great detail. There are the fancy clothes. We see clothes that are decorated with ribbons, with silks, sometimes with silver attached to them, both for men and for women. So, we have to think about the style of the time. But there's also a lot of talk about the more common clothes, right? The stockings, how many pairs of stockings that these women have, the undergarments that are sort of part of their daily wear. One thing I will say, I expected to see in my research, the later period of time, especially as we get past the Spanish era into the Mexican period, more manufactured cloth items coming in, and I haven't seen those reflected in the wills. It might be a lack of description, or it might be just a matter of when the will is written, right? They haven't seen that impact quite yet. But it's certainly there. I mean, we see it amongst the inventories of merchants, right? Pre-manufactured textiles coming in. Also, a lot of women own looms. If we talk about another way to think about material culture, gendered work. Mm-hmm. Yes, yes.
There is a, if I can bring a question of my own. There's one instance in which a widow is displeased with the way her husband disposed of her property, but I forget if it was San Antonio or one of the other communities you studied. And it may give us a little hint as to marital relationships
Yes, that was San Antonio. Yeah, this was a woman who said that her husband took a bracelet of hers, I think it was emeralds, she described it, and sold it without her consent. And he used that money to pay for part of the construction of the home, to expand the home. And it was like a room and a door, if I remember correctly. And she said, until he pays me back or reimburses me, I claim this part of the home, like in this very direct sense. It's the only time I saw any type of discord like that. But one of the things it shows us is that, yes, we have these laws, right? But they can be contested, right? Yeah.
Another item I found interesting related to the home was the fact that certain rooms in the house had already been deeded to, let's say, a married son or a married daughter.
Right.
Like deeding a room versus a house. And if you have some college kids coming back, be careful about what you say about whether it's their room or not.
Right.
But you want to explain that a little bit?
Yeah. So this was a type of division of property, right, where a family has a house that has several rooms, and they will split them up amongst children. Now, I suspect in some cases I found it, but I don't know if it's enough to see a pattern, where the children will then make some type of economic exchange. They'll sell that room so that one person might stay in that area. But sometimes, yes, you can see it in census documents, families, multiple families living together. So, yeah.
There's
I'm sure
a question up there,
problems.
so I don't dominate this whole thing. Although I have all the best questions, but that's right. Yes, please.
It's not a question, but the 1795 census for San Antonio lists about 5 families that have slaves, and it's a total of about 10 slaves.
Yeah.
So
I think, San Antonio has a small population at that time, but it's quite a small number, I would say. And I think as we go through the later period, I even see, a woman comes from Louisiana and she brings slaves. A woman comes from Florida. So sometimes they're coming from places where slavery was a bit more common. Yeah. Thanks, Robert.
Back to Gilberto's point about the division of houses. When you were talking about the material culture of religion and women's role in that, I found that really interesting, thinking about the Comandancia, what becomes rebranded as the Spanish Governor's Palace, and the fact that it's split into, in Ignacio Perez II's 1849 will, into 3 different parts, going to his wife and 2 of the daughters. And one of the rooms is the Chapel of the Blessed Virgin Mary.
Yes.
Which, weirdly enough, there's no evidence that that was a chapel during the Comandancia era, but there's proof positive in his will that that was its use in the household. And it's interesting hearing you say that, because it seems to suggest that did that go to the most religious daughter, or
right? It's hard to say.
That?
Yeah, hard to say how those decisions are made. But I think this is important. Some of the wealthier families have chapels, in fact, at their homes. But the other thing I find challenging with interpreting the material culture is it's really hard to get out of our modern mindset. And there isn't a separation of church and state, or religion and people's everyday temporal lives, right? It's within the home. The chapel can be within the home. But yeah, I don't know how that decision was made.
I have a question. Can you say something about the monetary values and monetary systems that were used at this time? It was still probably based on the Spanish system, I would imagine, but nothing is mentioned in the wills about, I'm going to leave so much money to here, I'm going to get so much money of that. Maybe you can comment on something like that.
No, there would be inventories that are conducted afterwards, and they often do assign monetary values to animals, livestock, to land at times. So, that's not research that I've done, but some people have done it to try to figure out what things are worth at the time. And again, for New Mexico, we have the work of Ross Frank, who's done a lot of that economic work and found these tables that explain what, like a peso de la tierra, that was a common term in New Mexico, what it was worth during a certain period of time. I don't know if anybody's done that for San Antonio. But there are a few people who note salaries that are due to soldiers, and they might mention specific amounts. And then there was one very wealthy woman whose husband died on a ship, and he had a lot of money. I think she mentioned it was like 3,000. She called it the Spanish coin, the Spanish dollars in a bank or in the treasury in Saltillo is how she referred to it. So there's glimpses, but almost none of this. Yeah, when we're looking at what I'm looking at, you know, people sort of at the, I'm not going to say the bottom because wealthier people tend to leave wills, but they're not talking about monetary figures.
Let me follow up on that just a minute because it's related to money. They do leave money. I don't know, again, if it's San Antonio or the other communities you studied, for masses.
Yes.
And then,
oh, yeah, that's
and
right.
then there's the donations for very interesting causes. The liberation of Jerusalem, the poor women left alone because of the Napoleonic Wars.
Yes.
Is that from San Antonio?
Yes, that's I mean that's across all of the communities.
I mean,
yes.
so they have this view of this wider world that and things that are happening, you know.
Yeah,
that,
this is stuff that's
and they're vested in it.
Yeah. Well, they're required.
Oh,
So they're
I see.
required. They're the mandas forzosas,
Oh,
the
I see.
mandatory bequests. So when somebody dies, these are mandated by the church and by the state that they pay a certain amount. And a lot of them will say pay the customary amount because there's an amount that's set at each time for these
Oh, I
causes.
see. Oh, okay.
But yes, and sometimes they pay more than the customary amount, and that shows that devotion. In New Mexico, they are a bit more likely to say, set aside this much money, this many pesos, for example, for a funeral or to pay for masses.
So there is money available, obviously.
It's, in some cases, they're telling their executors to collect on debts to get the money to. So it's hard to say for sure.
Okay, let's take that question here.
Thanks, Amy, for your talk. But gendered items would be, for example, in this case, weapons, right, which
Yeah.
are extremely important.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested to know what happens with the weapons, especially in widowed families, right? And you're talking about an item that would be of some import, right?
Yes.
So can you speak to how weapons are transferred in that way?
Right. Yeah. Generally, if possible, they are transferred through a male line. But there are some women that note ownership of some of these escopetas. Would be the most common. There's some. I'm not good at translating them. The trabucos, the guns. Somebody help me with the. I don't want to say the wrong word. I'm not great with. Are they escopeta? I don't think that translates exactly as a musket, but shotgun. Okay, thank you. Yeah. So there's definitely generally a scarcity of these weapons, and the settlers complain about it a lot. They ask the government to give them more weapons to help protect them on the frontier. So there are some presidial soldiers who have a little bit more of the gear, not necessarily the weaponry, but they might talk about a vest or a shield, you know, those type of protective items. But yeah, I have seen some women who have these items. They don't talk about how they're used in any ways. They just mention they own them.
On the issue of the criados, is there another question? On the issues of the criados, if I remember correctly from seeing other literature, that they tend to be underage.
Right.
And so the implication is that once they get to adulthood or marriage, that they are no longer criados in those
Yes.
households.
Right. Oftentimes they're very young children who won't even have a memory of where they came from originally, and they'll be raised in Spanish households. And yeah, in that sense, the father of the household generally would approve a marriage, you know, when the criado, when the person is of marriageable age, and the person would marry and move out of the household. And where we have really large populations in New Mexico, some of these people form their own communities, like Abiquiu in New Mexico, where you have many of these, they're sometimes called like detribalized Indians who grew up in Spanish society, but ethnically, you know, they're Indian.
Another question, one last question about money. There was a priest who owed 3,000 pesos.
Yeah, I don't know what he was doing.
What? What was it to merchants, to a merchant family or something? Or
Yeah,
was-
I think in that case, I think that family might have been a merchant family. I saw that and I tried to investigate it a little bit further, and I couldn't figure out
how he got in debt.
Yes, yes, what he was doing, because that's a huge amount of money.
Well, Amy, it was I enjoyed the book, and I think the folks enjoyed your presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.